A single empire in Europe would take over a quarter of the planet's land and population. The foundations began on the lands of England, with a powerful British monarchy igniting an extraordinary story of exploration and world domination. The British Empire saw the greatest stories of human achievement and triumph, but also saw the worst sides of humanity. After the discovery of America around 500 years ago, they ventured out into the oceans. The British would encounter unknown civilizations, creating historic partnerships and rivalries. Within 4 centuries, the empire would be worth over $600 billion. But how did an empire that owned parts of the Americas, Asia, Africa, and even Australia eventually come to an end? We must start from the beginning. Long before the knowledge of far-flung places, a man by the name of King Alfred the Great had to defend his small Anglo-Saxon kingdom from the invading Danish Vikings. In 878 AD, the Vikings under Guthrum launched a massive invasion, and Alfred was forced to retreat to the marshlands of Somerset, where he sought refuge on the Isle of Athelney. Alfred used this time to regroup and gather loyal followers. He formed a strong army, and in a decisive battle at Edington, he defeated the Viking leader Guthrum. The victory forced Guthrum to sign the Treaty of Wedmore, which established the Dane Law, a region of England where Viking rule was officially recognized, but also secured peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. He then began the process of unifying all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which his grandson Athelstan would finish. In 924, when Athelstan ascended to the throne of Wessex, his rule faced opposition and challenges from rival claimants, particularly from the Viking-controlled areas of Northumbria and Mercia. Despite these obstacles, Athelstan proved to be a capable and determined leader. In 927 AD, Athelstan managed to conquer Northumbria and effectively unite England under his rule, which led Athelstan to be the first king of England. 200 years later, that battleground would be set when English King Henry II wanted to expand his kingdom to Ireland. In the spring of 1171, King Henry II, accompanied by a retinue of knights and soldiers, sailed from England to Waterford, Ireland. Upon his arrival, he quickly set about asserting his authority, demanding the submission of various Irish kings and chieftains to his rule. Henry was determined to establish English control over Ireland, and firmly believed that the Irish kings should acknowledge his sovereignty. As news of King Henry's arrival spread across the island, reactions among the Irish leaders were mixed. However, when various Irish bishops and clergymen met at the Synod of Cashel in 1171, these religious leaders recognized Henry II as the sovereign ruler of Ireland, acknowledging his authority to rule the island, making Ireland the first colony of England, long before anyone knew they would be a global empire. Another 100 years later, in 1277, King Edward I of England wanted to bring Wales under his control and incorporate it into his kingdom. His desire to conquer Wales was driven by strategic, political, and territorial motivations. The journey towards the conquest of Wales began with the First Welsh War in 1277. Edward I launched a determined invasion into Gwynedd, the heartland of Welsh resistance in North Wales. His forces clashed with the Welsh defenders. Though fierce and relentless, the Welsh were eventually defeated, and their ruler, Prince Llewellyn, was compelled to submit to Edward's authority. Having established his dominance in Gwynedd, Edward I set out to solidify his control over Wales. He understood that military might alone not be enough to subdue the Welsh spirit of resistance, so he devised a multi-pronged strategy. One of the critical components of his plan was to construct a network of imposing fortresses across Wales to maintain English dominance and keep the Welsh in check. Despite the initial show of force, Welsh resistance persisted, and in 1282, a second conflict erupted known as the Second Welsh War. The war was fierce and hard-fought, but fate was not on the side of the Welsh. With the Welsh resistance largely quelled, Edward I swiftly solidified his conquest, making Wales part of the English kingdom. England's war struggles aren't done yet. From 1337 to 1453, the 100-Year War began with England and France. The everlasting conflict weakened both empires and kept England tied to their tiny island. Right after the 100 Years' War, England was amid another war. This time, it was between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, in the infamous War of the Roses from 1455 to 1487. The Lancastrians won, and King Henry VI was declared king. The rest of the world was starting to open up. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and landed in the Bahamas. After his initial landing, Columbus explored several other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, now shared between the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He also explored the coasts of present-day Central and South America, including Venezuela and Panama. This discovery of a massive landmass led the British government to desire land on this new continent. When Italian Giovanni Caboto sought support from King Henry VII to explore this new continent and find a direct route to Asia, King Henry was intrigued and granted Caboto a patent, which authorized him to explore and claim any lands he might discover for the English crown. Giovanni changed his name to John Cabot, and he was ready to go. In May 1497, Cabot set sail from Bristol, England, in hopes to find a passageway to Asia. He led a crew of about 18 men aboard a small ship called the Matthew. Their journey across the Atlantic was challenging, as they faced treacherous weather conditions and unknown dangers. After several weeks at sea, on June 24, 1497, Cabot and his crew finally spotted land. They had arrived somewhere along the eastern coast of North America, in an area later named Newfoundland, as it was newfound land. Cabot and his crew were greeted by an unfamiliar landscape and encountered indigenous peoples, likely the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, who had lived in the region for thousands of years. Cabot claimed the land for England, planting the English flag on the shore and taking possession of the newly discovered territory. The exact duration of Cabot's stay in the New World is uncertain, but it is believed that he explored the coastline briefly before returning to England, arriving back in Bristol in August 1497, where he was celebrated as a hero for his achievements. Cabot's discovery spread quickly throughout Europe, generating great excitement and interest. His successful voyage provided the English with hope of finding a western route to Asia and competing with other European powers in the lucrative trade markets of the East. Encouraged by his success, Cabot made a second voyage in 1498, possibly intending to explore further and solidify England's claim to the newfound lands. However, the details of this expedition are lost to history. Some reports suggest that the voyage was successful, while others claim it ended in disaster, with Cabot and his crew lost at sea. While back in England, King Henry VIII was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. During their beginning years of marriage, everything was going fine. Like any king at the time, he was forced to be loyal to the Catholic Church and yearned for a strong and legitimate heir to secure his dynasty. However, Henry's heart grew heavy with a troubling dilemma as the years passed. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had only yielded a single surviving child, Princess Mary. The king's desperate desire for a male heir began to consume him, and he became increasingly convinced that his marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. Turning to the Pope for a solution, Henry beseeched the Holy See to grant him an annulment of his marriage to Catherine. He argued that the marriage was unlawful, for Karen had previously been married to his older brother Arthur, who had passed away. According to the Old Testament, marrying one's brother's widow was strictly forbidden, and Henry believed this was why he lacked a male heir. However, fate had other plans. The Pope, influenced by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, refused to grant the annulment. Frustration and desperation gripped the king's heart, and he made a momentous decision. In a bold and unprecedented move, Henry VIII decided to break away from the Roman Catholic Church and establish his own church within England. So, in 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, formally severing England's ties to the papacy and officially creating the Church of England, with King Henry VIII to be its spiritual leader, and Anglicism was born. After King Henry divorced and beheaded his other wives, his daughter from Catherine, Mary I, became queen, and was nicknamed Bloody Mary through her killing spree to re-establish Catholicism. But her reign was short-lived, as her half-sister Elizabeth I would soon take over and redeclare England to be a Protestant state. Elizabeth passed the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which made Elizabeth supreme governor of the Church of England. She also passed the Act of Uniformity, establishing the Book of Common Prayer as the official liturgy. However, outside of England, the race for colonization has already begun. Under King Philip, the Spanish established colonies across the South American continent. The Spanish were expanding their wealth, from the former capital of the Aztec, Tenochtitlan, to Machu Picchu in Peru, and the Andes Mountains in Chile. Along the Brazilian coast, the Portuguese had several settlements, like São Vicente, Pernambuco, and Rio de Janeiro. The French established northern colonies in Quebec, and some small territories in Florida called Fort Caroline. The race for overseas land was on. So, Queen Elizabeth commissioned an army of seafarers to discover this planet. The group, colloquially known as the Sea Dogs, was given legal access to pillage and loot all Spanish ships they saw, with the hopes of creating British dominance on the global stage. One of her first appointees was John Hawkins, a pardoned killer who saved his life by joining the Royal Navy. In 1561, Hawkins made a voyage down to the Canary Islands, a Spanish island colony off the coast of Africa. Hawkins saw a process that would make him wealthy and hurt human beings. He learned about how to capture and sell people into slavery. With his new knowledge, in 1562, Hawkins set sail, traveling along the African coast to Sierra Leone, where he captured 300 Africans and trapped them in their ship. From there, he sailed to the Caribbean. He did not have permission from either Spain or Portugal to trade with their colonies, so he sold his enslaved people in Isabela, Puerto de Plata, and Monte Cristi, places where the local authorities did not enforce government trade embargoes. The enslaved people were traded for pearls, hides, and sugar. The trade was so prosperous that when he returned to England, he was knighted and to be called Sir. In October 1564, Hawkins went on another voyage back to Sierra Leone. He took over 400 enslaved people from Africa. Some he bought from the Portuguese, others he kidnapped directly by raiding the coast. He left Africa on January 29, 1565. On April 3, 1565, Hawkins arrived at Borborada in Venezuela. As trade was prohibited, he carried out a fake threat of force with the local governor's collusion. He then traveled to Rio de la Hacha, where he used power to ensure the deals he thought were fair. He sold 300 enslaved people. He was paid in gold, silver, and other precious items, and took further orders to trade enslaved people on a future voyage. His third slave voyage wasn't as easy as the first two. When he arrived on the African coast, he could not gather any enslaved people because of a Portuguese embargo. He attempted to capture and kidnap the inhabitants of a village near Cape Verde, but he was wounded and had to retreat. Hawkins recruited a local king in Sierra Leone to help him forcibly kidnap people, capturing over 500 people. On February 7, 1568, he set sail across the Atlantic Ocean to sell these people. He sold some of his captives in Margarita Province and others in Borborada. At Rio de la Hacha, the governor refused him permission to trade, so Hawkins and his assistant Francis Drake shot at his house, and they took over the town before selling the enslaved people. On his retreat, though, the voyage ran into the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua because of a storm. The Spanish cannons roared to life in the middle of peace talks, sending cannonballs hurtling through the air towards the English ships. Though outnumbered, Hawkins' fleet maneuvered skillfully, evading the deadly projectiles and returning fire with cannons. The battle raged on, and the English sailors fought with fierce determination. However, amid the chaos, Hawkins and his men had a choice: retreat or spend the rest of their lives in a Spanish galley. 114 men became prisoners, while Hawkins and 15 others returned to England and made a handsome profit. Regardless of the morals, slavery was a lucrative business, and the English would do anything to protect it. That's when, in 1577, she sent Francis Drake to find a new trade passage to Asia. Unlike previous explorers, Drake knew of the existence of America and wanted to find a way around the massive landmass so they could reach the lands of Asia. Drake's first destination was around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. The fierce winds roared and the waves towered like mountains, testing the crew's resolve and camaraderie, but Drake's steady leadership and unwavering determination carried them through, and they emerged from the Strait of Magellan into the boundless Pacific Ocean. The world was their oyster as they sailed northward along the western coast of South America. The landscapes were a tapestry of untamed beauty, and the wildlife fascinated and intrigued them. As they journeyed onward, they reached a land of wonder, the present-day coast of California. Here, they made a landfall in a place of beauty and bounty, naming it Nova Albion in honor of England, their beloved homeland. Their voyage then stretched through the Pacific and took them to Indonesia, which was aptly called the Spice Islands at the time, a treasure trove of fragrant delights. Here, they traded with the welcoming locals, exchanging goods and stories from distant lands. The journey homeward was challenging. The vastness of the Indian Ocean and the unpredictable seas tested them, but Drake's ingenuity and determination guided them safely around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. Finally, after nearly 3 years of adventure and discovery, the Golden Hind returned to England in September 1580 and was knighted as Sir Francis Drake. Looking upon this new world, the English realized that if they wanted to grow as an empire, they would need to establish a colony in the new world. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to explore and colonize the lands of the New World. Raleigh dispatched an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville to Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The group consisted of about 100 men, including soldiers, scientists, and artisans. They arrived in 1585 and began building a fort and interacting with the local Native American tribes. The relationship between the English colonists and the Native Americans was initially positive, as they traded goods and exchanged knowledge. However, tensions rose over time, and the region's harsh conditions, including disease and food shortages, strained the colonists' morale. Amid the challenges, Sir Francis Drake, on his way back to England after another successful privateering expedition, offered to take the colonists back with him. Disheartened by the hardships, many of the settlers accepted the offer and returned to England in 1586, leaving the Roanoke colony to fail. Raleigh tried again a year later in 1587 with 118 settlers, but yet it was found abandoned just 3 years later. In 1588, Spanish King Philip II felt he had a moral duty to take over England in the name of Catholicism. So he sent the Spanish Armada, which wasn't just an ordinary naval force. It was arguably one of the scariest ones in history. The Armada consisted of around 130 ships. Among these ships were galleons, which were the principal warships of the Armada. Galleons were large, heavily armed vessels that were the backbone of the Spanish fleet during that period. Accompanying the fleet were more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines who were part of the expedition. The soldiers were seasoned veterans, while the sailors were experienced navigators and crew members, many of whom had participated in previous naval campaigns. The Spanish Armada was intended to be a formidable force capable of overpowering any opposition and making England a colony of the Spanish Empire. On the other side of the English Channel, Queen Elizabeth and her advisors were well aware of the impending threat. She called upon her naval commander, Sir Francis Drake, and her vice admiral, Charles Howard, to prepare the English fleet for the upcoming battle. Despite being outnumbered and having fewer and smaller ships, the English Navy had a significant advantage in maneuverability and firepower. In the late spring of 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed towards England, confident of its superiority. However, the English had a cunning plan. Using smaller, more agile ships, they sacked the Armada as it made its way along the coast of England. The English ships would attack from the rear, firing salvos at the larger, slower Spanish vessels, and then quickly retreat, making it difficult for the Armada to respond effectively. As the Spanish fleet approached the English Channel, the English sent 8 fire ships, vessels loaded with flammable materials and set ablaze, towards the Armada. The sight of the fiery infernos heading their way unnerved the Spanish sailors, who broke formation to avoid the risk of being consumed by the flames. This disruption further weakened the Spanish fleet and allowed the English to gain a tactical advantage. The decisive Battle of Gravelines came on July 29, 1588, off the coast of Gravelines, France. The English fleet engaged the Spanish Armada in a fierce and prolonged battle. The English employed innovative naval tactics, including shipboarding techniques involving grappling hooks and small arms fire to engage the enemy at close quarters. After a full day of intense fighting, the Spanish Armada, battered and disoriented, attempted to regroup. However, the English were relentless in their pursuit. With dwindling supplies and morale, the Armada began to retreat, trying to navigate back to Spain. The journey back to Spain was a harrowing one for the Spanish Armada. Harsh storms and strong currents took their toll on the already weakened fleet. By the time the remnants of the Armada reached Spain, it was but a shadow of its former self. While closer to home, England wanted to expand their power over Ireland. At the time, Ireland was divided into 2 main regions, the Pale and the Gaelic Irish regions. The Pale, which is located under the Greater Dublin region, was under English control and authority, while the Gaelic Irish regions were largely autonomous and operated under traditional Brian law. In the Gaelic Irish regions, the English sought to assert more control over the island and imposed policies that threatened the Irish way of life, leading to rising tensions and discontent among the Gaelic lords. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, was in the middle of this brewing storm. He was a man of noble birth and strong convictions, torn between his loyalty to the English crown and his love for the land and its people. As the Earl of Tyrone, he held significant sway over the province of Ulster, located in the north of the country. He, though, was tired of all the power-hungry demands of the English Empire, and could not bear to see his beloved Ireland suffer under the yoke of foreign rule. It was time for a rebellion. Hugh O'Neill raised his banner, calling upon other Gaelic lords to join him in a resistance. Among those who rallied to his cause was Hugh O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, a fierce and noble warrior in his own right. United in purpose, the 2 lords formed a formidable alliance, determined to face the storm that awaited them. The English crown responded swiftly, sending forth armies led by seasoned commanders like Sir Henry Bagenal. Battle after battle ensued, each skirmish leaving the countryside scarred with the remnants of the struggle. As the days turned into months and then into years, the rebellion earned the name of the 9 Years' War. The Irish people and the English suffered, for the conflict brought untold hardships to both sides. As the Irish were near defeat, in 1601, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon when a small Spanish expeditionary force arrived to aid the Irish rebels. It was a welcome respite, and the tide seemed to turn in their favor for a moment. But fate had other plans. The turning point came at the Battle of Kinsale, where the Irish and Spanish forces suffered a crushing defeat. The dream of independence disappeared, and the rebellion's fate hung in the balance. In 1603, the rebellion came to an end. The Irish forces, tired and depleted, surrendered to the English crown. The terms of the Treaty of Mellifont granted pardons to the rebels, allowing them to retain some of their lands and religious freedoms. However, the treaty also led for the language of Gaelic to be systematically destroyed. Catholicism was to be strongly discouraged, only Anglicanism. Ireland was to be transformed into England, to no longer be a Gaelic country, but one of the Anglo-Saxons. However, England didn't just want to be the master of its neighbors, it wanted control over the New World. So, in 1606, the Virginia Company of London was founded to find wealth and a passage to the Pacific. With the blessing of King James on December 20th, 1606, 104 settlers left the River Thames in London and, throughout the cold, blistery winter, went off to the New World. After a grueling winter on sea, on the fateful day of May 13th, 1607, the settlers arrived on a marshy peninsula in a town they've named Jamestown, after their king. Upon reaching the shores of the New World, the colonists marveled at the breathtaking beauty of the untamed land. The lush green forests, crystal clear waters, and abundant wildlife promised a paradise. But paradise quickly turned into a harsh reality. The unfamiliar environment presented numerous challenges. With its relentless heat and humidity, the Virginia climate proved unbearable for many. Disease spread among the settlers, taking its toll on their health and strength. Malaria and dysentery ran rampant, claiming many lives and making each day a struggle for survival. The colonists faced another formidable adversary: hunger. They had arrived when crops were not yet ready for harvest. With dwindling supplies and no fertile soil to plant, the settlers found themselves on the brink of starvation. Their situation was dire, but the settlers' spirits were not quickly broken. They toiled day and night, determined to find a way to survive and thrive in this new land. They explored the surroundings, hoping to find sustenance and establish relations with the native inhabitants, the Powhatan Confederacy. However, the initial interactions with the Powhatans were fraught with misunderstandings and mistrust. The settlers struggled to communicate and negotiate, leading to clashes and heightened tensions. The Powhatans, understandably cautious of these strangers, did not readily embrace the newcomers. Leadership within the colony also faced challenges. With shifting power dynamics and a lack of solid direction, the settlers grappled with maintaining unity and order. The departure of their bold leader, John Smith, further exacerbated the situation, leaving them adrift. In the harsh winter of 1609, known as the Starving Time, the colonists faced their darkest hour. Food supplies ran out, and desperation set in. They ate whatever they could find, even horses, pets, and leather, but it was never enough. The colony's population dwindled as hunger, disease, and conflicts with the Powhatans took their toll. Despite all odds, a glimmer of hope emerged. A young and innovative settler, John Rolfe, introduced tobacco cultivation to Jamestown. The crop thrived in the Virginia soil and climate, bringing financial prosperity to the struggling colony. Tobacco quickly became a valuable commodity, attracting more settlers and rejuvenating Jamestown's fortunes. With their determination renewed, the settlers worked tirelessly to build a better future. They established better relations with some of the Powhatans, learning from each other's ways and building bridges of understanding. An English colony was finally able to be established on American soil. While Jamestown was burgeoning as a colony, merchant William Hawkins was sent to establish trade in India. In 1607, he sailed from the port of Plymouth, England aboard the Hector, accompanied by a fleet of 3 ships. The crew was a mix of experienced sailors, traders, and diplomats, carrying various goods to trade with distant lands. After a perilous voyage fraught with storms and rough seas, the fleet arrived at the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, marking a significant milestone in their journey. They entered the vast Indian Ocean and made their way towards the western coast of India. Hawkins arrived in the port of Surat in 1608, one of the most important trading centers on the Indian west coast. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who ruled over a vast empire, showed a keen interest in foreign trade and welcomed the English visitors. Hawkins' first meeting with Emperor Jahangir occurred in Agra, near the famous Taj Mahal. Through skilled interpreters, they engaged in discussions about trade, politics, and culture. The emperor was intrigued by the English goods and desired further interaction and trade with England. The negotiations between Hawkins and the Mughal emperor resulted in a favorable agreement, granting the English East India Company the privilege to establish a trading post in Surat. This marked the official beginning of England's trade relations with India. By 1612, the Surat trading post was an entire operation, where the English would begin trading for various Indian goods, such as textiles, spices, and indigo, in exchange for English weapons and metalware. In 1615, an English diplomat of the name Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the Grand Court of Emperor Jahangir of the Mughal Emperor. As Sir Thomas Roe stepped into the opulent halls of the Mughal court, he was greeted with a display of cultural grandeur unmatched in the West. The colorful fabrics, the exquisite jewelry, and the sweet aroma of incense filled the air. The English envoy was mesmerized by the splendor of the Mughal Empire. Amidst the regal surroundings, Sir Thomas Roe presented King James I's letter to Emperor Jahangir, a token of goodwill and friendship. In return, he gave a collection of rare English goods, marveling at the Mughal appreciation for luxurious commodities. Over the 3 years Roe spent in Jahangir's court, England increased trade and influence in the lands of India. While back in England, King James made his religious expectations very clear. Everyone must be Anglican. If you do not comply, leave. That's when the idea of America came to spark in their minds. A place where they can openly practice whatever they choose without any say by the government. If one wanted to practice a religion, they could. Of course, most people wouldn't leave their homes for an unknown place if they weren't genuinely convicted of their beliefs. Only the most faithful and those who genuinely desire religious freedom would dare go on this voyage. The people who did were called pilgrims. So, in mid-July 1620, the English Mayflower ship and the Dutch Speedwell ship were set to depart from Southampton. But yet, shortly after the crews were about to depart, the Speedwell sprung up a leak, forcing it to return to Dartmouth for repairs. They made a new start after the repairs, but more than 200 miles beyond Land's End, at the southwestern tip of England, Speedwell sprang another leak. It was now early September, and they had no choice but to abandon Speedwell and decide on which passengers. However, this decision was not easy because while the Speedwell was making repairs, the other pilgrims on the Mayflower were eating all of the rations that were supposed to last until they made it to the New World. During the time of repair, the passengers never left the ship. After 3 months of delay, the Mayflower sailed from Plymouth, England alone on September 16, 1620. The chances of the Mayflower making it to the New World was low, because it was built to transport wine between England and Bordeaux, not across the Atlantic Ocean. Yet they were driven by a purpose, the purpose of creating a new civilization for God. Their beliefs gave the passengers strength to crouch in semi-darkness below deck. With waves tossing the boat in different directions, men held on to their wives, who themselves had on to their children. Water was soaking everyone and everything above and below the deck. In mid-ocean, the ship came close to being totally disabled and may have had to return to England or risk sinking. A storm badly damaged its main beam that even the sailors despaired. By a stroke of luck, one of the colonists had a metal jackscrew he had purchased in Holland to help construct the new settler homes. They used it to secure the beam, which kept it from cracking further, thus maintaining the vessel's seaworthiness. Despite the crowding, unsanitary conditions, and seasickness, they somehow made it to Cape Cod on November 21st, with only one fatality, establishing the colony of Plymouth. However, their luck will soon fade, because by December, most of the passengers had become ill, coughing violently and suffering from the effects of scurvy. By March, only 47 colonists had survived, but yet the Pilgrims were resilient people who could build houses and didn't die off completely. Shortly after the establishment of Plymouth, explorer Thomas Warner wanted to grow the empire down to the tropical Caribbean islands. On January 28, 1624, they landed on the island and established the colony of St. Christopher. which is now called St. Kitts today. In 1625, French captain Pierre Ballon de Sandbuc joined the English and established a joint colony between the two countries. The reason Warner accepted the newcomers was nothing but benevolent. He was beginning to fear the native Kalingo tribe of the Carib people. Kalingo leader Ubito Tegramonte held a secret meeting in 1626 with the other heads and decided to attack the Europeans on the night of the next full moon. The plan was revealed to the Europeans by an Igneri woman named Barb. She was recently brought to St. Kitts as a slave wife after the Kalingo raided an Arawak island. The English and French joined forces and attacked the Kalinago at night. The colonists killed between 100 and 120 Caribs in their beds that night, with only the most beautiful Kalinago women spared to serve as slaves. The following day, the French and British settlers rounded up the roughly 4,000 Kalinago natives and killed them while attempting to surrender. After the massacre, piles and piles of dead, rotting bodies lingered throughout the point. The Bloody Point. The river was red with blood. The Bloody River. The remaining Kalinago people fled to neighboring islands. With all of the Kalinago people dead, a nasty problem has arrived. Who was supposed to do the labor-intensive tobacco farming? It wasn't going to be the Europeans. Instead, they looked to Africa, and thus the slave trade was in high demand. While the English weren't done colonizing in the Caribbean, in 1625, they settled in Barbados. In 1627, they had Nevis. In 1632, they settled in Montserrat and Antigua. The British were not going anyway, and they were determined to make a profit in the Caribbean. While back in England, the religious atmosphere for extreme religious groups looked bleak for the Puritans. When King Charles I had ascended the throne in 1625, he doubled down on his hatred for non-Anglicans. His atmosphere of intolerance led Puritan religious and business leaders to consider immigration to the New World as a viable means to escape persecution. In March 1629, King Charles dissolved Parliament, beginning 11 years of rule without it. The Puritans were livid. They wanted freedom, yet Charles was a dictator. That's why, under the leadership of Minister John Winthrop, they've decided to leave. On April 8, 1630, 11 ships left the Isle of Wight, carrying Winthrop and 700 other settlers. When the settlers landed in Salem, Massachusetts, later that year, John Winthrop gave a sermon, a model of Christian charity that would change American history. The Massachusetts Bay Colony wasn't just another money-making expedition like Jamestown or St. Kitts. They viewed themselves as the people who would change the world. Their strict moral code would impress upon God and shine them to the center of history. Throughout the next 10 years, about 20,000 Puritans emigrated from England to Massachusetts and the neighboring colonies during the Great Migration. However, due to the sudden influx of Puritan settlers and slight religious differences, they migrated all across New England. Thomas Hooker established the Connecticut colony, while Thomas Williams established the colony of Rhode Island, allowing for the growth of the Puritan religion and creating more cities on a hill. The Puritans weren't the only ones struggling with Anglicanism. Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, pursued an audacious plan. As the holder of the title, he was granted a charter by King Charles I in 1632 for lands in the New World. This charter recognized his right to establish a colony north of Virginia, which he named Maryland in honor of the Catholic Queen, Henrietta Maria. Cecil Calvert never set foot in Maryland, but his influence was deeply felt. Under his guidance in 1634, two ships, the Ark and the Dove, carried the first settlers across the Atlantic. These pioneers, a mix of Catholics seeking religious freedom and Protestants hoping for economic opportunities, established the colony's first settlement, St. Mary's City. While the Americans weren't the ones struggling with Anglicanism, even though Scotland was neighbors with the English, they had their own religious traditions called the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. While King Charles I was focused on converting Scotland to Anglicanism, the Scottish Covenanter army was ready to defend. As Charles sent 20,000 soldiers to Edinburgh, he could not penetrate the Scottish army of 16,500 men in the border town of Berwick. Charles joined his troops at Berwick on May 30th, 1639, announcing he would not invade Scotland as long as the Scottish Covenanter army remained 10 miles north of the border. For now, there will be peace in Scotland. While across the world in India, the British East India Company was growing in influence. Trade between the sects of the world was eclipsing what the rest of Europe intended. This created the desire for a tiny parcel of land within the Indian subcontinent. So in 1639, the British East India Company dispatched two of its agents, Francis Day and Andrew Cogan, to the shores of the Coromandel coast. Day and Cogan arrived in the bustling port of Masulipatanam, a central trading hub of the Vijayanagara Empire. They came with ambitions to establish a foothold in the region to secure their trade interests and compete with other European powers vying for control over these lucrative waters. Negotiations with the local Nayak rulers were complex. After months of discussions and an exchange of gifts, a deal was struck. The British East India Company secured a tract of land, a mere stretch of coastal dunes and palm trees, which they intended to develop into a trading post. The company could have spent more time with a modest parcel of land under their control. They began constructing a humble trading post consisting of a few warehouses and shelters for traders. The initial goal was to facilitate the exchange of goods, primarily textiles, spices, and precious metals, between the Indian subcontinent and England. The site was named Fort St. George, as a nod to England's patron saint, St. George. The name held religious significance and underscored the company's intent to establish a lasting presence. As trade flourished, so did the security concerns. The shifting alliances and rivalries among European powers in the region, such as the Portuguese and Dutch, prompted the company to rethink the nature of its trading post. The simple structures began to transform into more substantial buildings, and defensive walls started to encircle the settlement. This transformation was more than just a matter of protection. It was a tangible manifestation of the company's growing ambitions. Fort St. George was becoming more than just a trading post. It was a strategic center of influence. While back in the Isle of Ireland, the Irish Catholics were forced to give up their lands to British and Scottish settlers. These lands were redistributed to English-speaking Protestants, with the remainder going to deserving native Irish lords and clans. So naturally, this led to an Irish rebellion in 1641. A faction of the Irish gentry, led by figures like Rory O'More and Sir Phelim O'Neill, attempted a coup in Dublin. The plan was to seize Dublin Castle, a symbol of English power, but the plot was discovered, forcing the conspirators to act prematurely, leading to ultimate failure. However, O'Neill and the Catholics were not done. In November 1641, the rebels tried to attack the town of Lisnagarvey, but failed. Upset and angry, they lashed out in Portadown, a town that was once home to the McCann clan, that was now resettled with new settlers. The Irish forces managed to overpower the British defenses, and in the aftermath, anger got the best of the British. On that chilling day, the Irish forced the Protestant prisoners to a wooden bridge that was intentionally broken in the middle. The Protestant prisoners were stripped and forced off the bridge into the cold river below. Those who tried to swim to safety were shot with muskets. It's estimated that around 100 settlers met this grim fate at the bridge, their cries echoing long after the waters had silenced them. In retaliation, in Island Magee, 24 Catholics were murdered in retaliation. The arrival of a Scottish Covenanter army in Ulster in April 1642 led to further such atrocities. On Rathlin Island, Scottish soldiers from Clan Campbell were encouraged by their commanding officer, Sir Duncan Campbell, to kill the local Catholic MacDonalds, who were related to the Campbells' enemies in Scotland, Clan MacDonald. They threw hundreds of MacDonald women over cliffs to their deaths. The killings were brought under some degree of control by Owen Roe O'Neill, who in July 1642 was given command of Irish forces in Ulster and hanged several rebels for attacking civilians. There was no unity among the Catholic leaders. They all acted upon their will. In order to win a war, you need to work together. So that's when all the Catholic leaders met in Kilkelly, where the Confederate Catholics of Ireland were born. Their goal was clear: to create an Irish Catholic state loyal to the English King Charles I, but autonomous in its functioning, because they knew it was their best chance for peace. The Confederation crafted its own governmental structure: an assembly to debate and make decisions, a council to oversee administrative functions, and a military arm to protect their interests. One of the Confederation's defining moments was the creation of an oath. This oath symbolized their dual loyalty to the Catholic Church and King Charles I. Members swore to uphold the rights of the Church in Ireland, ensuring its prominence and protection. Within a few months of the rebellion's outbreak, almost all Catholic gentry joined it. Local lords and landowners raised armed units of their dependents to control the violence that engulfed the country, fearing that after the settlers were gone, the Irish peasantry would also turn on them. Secondly, the Long Parliament, the Irish administration, and King Charles made it clear that Irish Catholics who did not demonstrate their loyalty would be held responsible for the rebellion and killings of settlers and would confiscate their lands as stated in the Adventures Act of 1642. This apparent act of appeasement would not last, though, as the British Isles were now at war. On the fateful day of January 4th, 1642, King Charles attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament. These 5 members, John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Haselrig, and William Strode, were known for opposing the king's policies and support for parliamentary rights. Charles I accused them of treason and other offenses, which led to a standoff between the king and Parliament. On June 4th, 1642, Parliament members sent a demand letter to King Charles called the 19 Propositions, which would reform how Parliament and the monarchy would work. Parliament would grow in power if passed, while the monarchy would be weakened. Within the propositions, Parliament is demanding various line items, such as, number 2, matters that concern the public must be debated in Parliament, not decided based upon the advice of private advisors. 6. Laws against Jesuits, Catholic priests, and Catholic recusants must be strictly enforced. 7. The vote of Catholic lords shall be taken away, and the children of Catholics must receive a Protestant education. 18. Charles must clear the 5 members of the House of Commons, along with Lord Kimbolton, of any wrongdoing. Though the Catholics in the Irish Confederation may be loyal to Charles, Parliament was angered by Charles's blatant disregard for the Anglican Church, so they demanded he change his stance. In response, Charles would write, "For all these reasons to all these demands, our answer is nolumus leges Angliae mutari. We are unwilling to change the laws of England." With tensions escalating, both sides began to gather support and muster their forces. By autumn, the rolling countryside near Edgehill became the stage for a pivotal clash between the royalist forces loyal to King Charles I and the parliamentarian troops supporting the cause of parliamentary supremacy. As the sun rose on October 23rd, the two sides arrayed against each other in a tense and charged atmosphere. The Royalist cavalry, led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, was known for their daring and fearless charges. On the opposite, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a seasoned general, commanded the parliamentarians. Rupert's cavaliers launched a ferocious charge that shattered the parliamentarian left flank as the battle commenced. The Royalists gained the upper hand. However, the Royalist infantry was unable to capitalize on the cavalry's success. The parliamentarian forces, while in disarray, managed to regroup and counterattack. The battle raged with fierce hand-to-hand combat, pitting brother against brother and friend against friend. But yet, after 2 days of fighting, there was no decisive winner. The war was set in motion, with neither side willing to relent. The following year, the Royalists, buoyed by early optimism, tasted victory. In the south, at Braddock Down, they swiftly defeated the parliamentarians. Further success followed at Stratton, consolidating their hold over Cornwall. Riding this wave, Prince Rupert showcased his military prowess at Chalgrove Field, even though the event was marred by the death of the parliamentarian icon, John Hampden. The Royalist cause seemed unstoppable. and this was further confirmed with their victories at Adwalden Moor and Roundway Down. By the end of the year, even the key city of Bristol had fallen into their hands. However, 1644 marked a shift. The parliamentarians, learning from their defeats, mounted a challenge. Their efforts culminated at Marston Moor, a vast expanse that bore witness to a dramatic turnaround. Here, under the watchful eyes of generals like Oliver Cromwell, the Royalist forces faced a crushing defeat, relinquishing their grip over the north. Later that year, the two sides met again at the First Battle of Newbury. Much like Edgehill, neither could claim an outright win. However, a turning point was on the horizon: the Battle of Naseby. As dawn broke on June 14, 1645, a palpable tension filled the air. Both armies faced each other, a mere few miles apart. The Royalists, confident and seasoned from earlier victories, anticipated another win. The parliamentarians, however, had been reorganizing and were now more formidable than ever, especially with Oliver Cromwell's new model army, a force known for its discipline and strategic prowess. The battle commenced with the customary roar of cannons, sending plumes of smoke into the morning sky. Initially, the Royalists seemed to have the upper hand, with their horsemen charging effectively against the parliamentarian flanks. But Cromwell, with his strategic acumen, had a card up his sleeve: his Ironsides, a cavalry regiment known for its staunch discipline and unwavering courage. As the Royalist cavalry believed they were gaining ground, they were met with a fierce countercharge by the Ironsides. The parliamentarians, with resounding shouts and unparalleled coordination, began to turn the tide. Cromwell's forces pushed back, cutting through the Royalist ranks, capturing King Charles himself and making him a prisoner. Charles was later put on trial for high treason. In Westminster Hall, Charles I defended his actions, but the trial ended with a guilty verdict. On a winter morning, the fallen monarch faced the executioner's blade, marking the shift from absolutism to a new era of governance: the era of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan, and like his brethren in Massachusetts, believed that the Anglican Church was corrupted by Charles and the way of the Royalists. So, in the new parliament, known as the Rump Parliament, Cromwell was able to be a general to attack the Irish Confederacy. In his mind, the Catholic belief was denying the primacy of the Bible and needed to be quelled. After he landed in Dublin on August 15, 1649, Cromwell took the fortified port towns of Drogheda and Wexford to secure logistical supplies from England. At the Siege of Drogheda in September 1649, his troops killed nearly 3,500 people after the town's capture. Around 2,700 Royalist soldiers, including some civilians, prisoners, and Roman Catholic priests. In October, another massacre took place in Wexford and killed 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 Irish civilians. Wexford was burned to ashes. Cromwell left Ireland in May 1650 after Scotland proclaimed Charles II, the son of Charles I, to be king. With this act of so-called treason, Cromwell felt the only action was war. On September 3, 1650, unexpectedly, Cromwell smashed the main Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar, killing 4,000 Scottish soldiers, taking another 10,000 prisoners, and then capturing the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. The following year, Charles II and his Scottish allies attempted to invade England and capture London, while Cromwell was engaged in Scotland. Cromwell followed them south and caught them at Worcester on September 3, 1651, and his forces destroyed the last major Scottish Royalist army at the Battle of Worcester. Under the generals Henry Ireton and Edmund Ludlow back in Ireland, the Irish were sieged into oblivion. The last Catholic-held town, Galway, surrendered in April 1652, and the latest Irish Catholic troops capitulated in April 1653 in County Cavan. In the wake of the Commonwealth's conquest of the island of Ireland, the public practice of Roman Catholicism was banned, and Catholic priests were killed when captured. all Catholic-owned land was confiscated under the Act for the Settlement of Ireland of 1652 and given to Scottish and English settlers, Parliament's financial creditors, and parliamentary soldiers. Presbyterianism was deemed illegal in Scotland, and they were forced to be a part of the Anglican Church. Oliver Cromwell was decorated as Lord Protectorate in 1653. With his position, he tried to make the rest of the British Isles more like England. He hated the Scottish clan system up in the partial jungle of the Highlands, so he destroyed it. Before Cromwell, there was no idea of land ownership in the Highlands. A clan would live on the land, and together they would survive off the resources communally. Together, they would have a chief. However, that would often change. However, Cromwell gave the titles of land to these chiefs, saying that they individually owned the land rather than the whole group. This, in turn, created a Scottish noble class of those who arbitrarily got the deed to the land and built a castle of impoverished, non-land-owning Scotsmen. This changed the entire function of Scottish society. The landowners wanted to make a profit rather than survive as a community. Following English ideals, the landowners wanted to make as much profit as humanly possible. So they started cutting down giant swaths of Scottish trees. This once prospering rainforest turned into a hilly, grassy field seemingly overnight. Then came the sheep. Over time, with these bare grass mountainous fields, the landowners realized they could make more profit by raising sheep than by farming. So, sheep were given endless land to graze, while the old clan members were forced to work parts of the land and were impoverished. Cromwell thought that making Scotland more English would be more civilized and enlightened. That English society is just so perfect that it must be spread all across the world to truly help those people who live in a world filled with cultural differences. That the English way is the only way. Cromwell thought he was doing Scotland a favor, but some see it as he ruined their entire society instead. He wouldn't be the last Brit to do just that. While most of Cromwell focused on the British Isles, he still wanted to have control against the Spanish in South America. So, he launched the Western Design Armada in the Caribbean. In April 1655, General Robert Venables led the English Armada in an attack on Spain's fort at Santo Domingo, Hispaniola. However, the Spanish quickly defended against this poorly executed siege of Santo Domingo, and the English troops were soon decimated by disease. Venables, not wanting to be a failure, went to the only Spanish colony in the area that did not have defensive capabilities, the sparsely populated island of Jamaica. In May 1655, around 7,000 English soldiers landed near Jamaica's Spanish town capital. The English invasion force soon overwhelmed the 2,500 residents, and it became an English colony. Of course, the Spanish wanted to regain the island, but were ultimately never able to gain a foothold in the island. Cromwell used the island to send prisoners of war and anyone who disobeyed his rule by making them indentured servants, forced to help grow the island's sugarcane production. However, tropical disease and harsh conditions made it hard for the colony to grow. In the year 1660, the reign of Cromwell was over, and the colonization race was on under new leadership. King Charles II was given power, and the British monarchy was restored. Charles II was dead set on bringing England to the rest of the world. In Africa, he established the Company of Royal Adventures trading into Africa. Charles II granted the company a complete monopoly of the gold trade and, in 1663, access to the ever-lucrative slave trade. While in the Americas, Charles established the Province of Carolina, which he named after himself. The charter gave 8 English nobles land access to lands that were part of modern-day Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. It was set up to be a buffer between the growing Spanish land grab and the swamps of Florida. Back in Africa, the English weren't the only ones trying to pillage Africa for their resources. The Dutch had established many settlements across the lucrative coast, and the English did not like it. Captain Robert Holmes was given authority to take over any Dutch fort he could. So, on January 22, 1664, he took the fort of Gorée. On March 28th, he took over Walcheren. On April 10th, he captured the principal Dutch base, Cape Coast Castle, in West Africa. Slightly after, in America, the English were looking to overtake the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, situated on the southern tip of Manhattan. On May 25, 1664, Colonel Richard Nicolls set out from Portsmouth with 4 warships and 300 soldiers. When they arrived on August 27th, he sent Dutch Director Governor Peter Stuyvesant a letter of lenient terms of surrender. The Dutch colonists would still be guaranteed possession of their property rights, enjoyment of religious freedom, and that all pubs would remain open. They would not have to follow the puritanical rules of Massachusetts. Rather, they would be their own colony. The people of New Amsterdam accepted, and the colony was renamed to New York. The Dutch in Europe were unhappy with this English conquering, so they sent out experienced naval Lieutenant Admiral Michael de Ruyter to defeat the English. First, he started in Africa, where he quickly reconquered all former Dutch forts the English conquered, except Cape Coast. After that, he sailed over to the Americas. In April 1665, he arrived off the coast of Barbados, destroying various English ships on the way. However, his army was weakened, and even though he was ordered to retake New York, he knew that his fleet could not handle it. Fighting that battle would result in imminent death, so in 1665, he went back to the Netherlands. In 1667, the Treaty of Breda was signed, where the English would have an absolute claim of the former New Netherlands, while the Dutch would regain control of the colony Suriname, which is in South America. With the Netherlands out of the picture, the path to further colonization in the Americas was at its forefront, but it wasn't without its controversies. Because up in the no-man's land of Canada lay the unambitious French colony of Montreal. The French were more hesitant to expand outside their predefined areas. They had their places where they would hunt furs, and they were to stay on that path. The French sustained all their colonial efforts from fur trading, which was in high demand in Europe. However, 2 French fur traders, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Maître de Grossières, learned from the native Cree peoples that the ultimate place for premium fur pellets was in the north and west of Lake Superior. The duo knew their opportunity, and if they wanted to be rich, they would have to go against the will of the French. As they set off into this mysterious land, most thought they wouldn't make it. But when they returned a year later to Montreal with premium furs, evidence of the potential of the Hudson Bay region, they were arrested by French authorities for trading without a license and fined, and their furs were confiscated by the government. Determined to establish trade in the Hudson Bay area, Radisson and Grossier approached a group of English colonial merchants in Boston, Massachusetts, to help finance their explorations. Eventually, the two met and gained the sponsorship of Prince Rupert, the cousin of King Charles II. In 1668, the English expedition acquired 2 ships, the Nonsuch and the Eaglet, to explore possible trade in the Hudson Bay. Grossier sailed on the Nonsuch, commanded by Captain Zachariah Gillam, while the Eaglet was commanded by Captain William Stannard, and accompanied by Radisson. On June 5, 1668, both ships left port at Deptford, England, but the Eaglet was forced to turn back off the coast of Ireland. The Nonsuch continued to James Bay, the southern portion of Hudson Bay, where its explorers founded in 1668 the first fort on Hudson Bay, Charles Fort, at the mouth of the Rupert River. After a successful trading expedition over the winter of 1669, Nonsuch returned to England on October 9, 1669, with the first cargo of fur resulting from trade in Hudson Bay. The bulk of this haul was sold to London's most prominent furrier, Thomas Glover, for £1,233. Calculating for inflation, the value of the furs would be worth $188,000 in today's pounds. After establishing viability and profitability in the company, King Charles II granted a monopoly over the region drained by all rivers and streams flowing into Hudson Bay to the Hudson Bay Company, a company that still exists today. While back in New England, the English colony started to grow at an increasingly accelerated rate. In 1624, the Massachusetts Bay Colony only was home to 180 people. Now, in 1675, it was the home of 64,000. With more people, the demand for more space, resources, and food increased. So, the colonists began expanding outside their tiny settlements to produce what they needed. Their de facto capital, Plymouth, was right in the center of the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Confederacy, a Native American tribe. At first, the Wampanoag were friendly towards Pilgrims, but their relationship began to sour over time. They tried to negotiate territorial boundaries. However, their fundamental differences in how land and property worked made it nearly impossible. The English viewed land as something an individual with the right deed could own, while the natives believed land was a communal resource to be shared for all. So, when the English tried to buy land from the natives, it was met with confusion and a lack of understanding. For all the Wampanoag knew, their new neighbors stole their land unjustly. In 1675, a single event ignited the Powder Keg. 3 Wampanoag men were executed by English authorities accused of the murder of a Christianized Native American named John Sassamon. This series of executions caused outrage among the Wampanoags, led by Metacom, with the English name of King Philip. Metacom led his warriors and attacked the Plymouth colony, starting at Swansea and going to Taunton, Brookfield, and Deerfield. The winter months did little to quell the conflict. Both sides endured harsh conditions, facing disease, starvation, and exposure. Battles raged, with Native American tribes joining Metacom's alliance against the colonists. The English launched counterattacks, leading to the infamous Battle of Great Swamp, where a Narragansett fort was captured with heavy casualties on both sides. As the conflict escalated, alliances shifted like sand in the wind. English authorities negotiated a treaty with the Mohawk tribe, hoping to gain a strategic advantage against Metacom's forces. Native American villages were razed, lives lost, and families torn apart. Metacom's leadership kept the alliance together, but his death in 1676 marked a turning point. He was assassinated by one of his best friends, John Alderman, who was known as the Praying Indian because of his Christian beliefs. With Metacom's death, the Native American alliance faltered, resistance dwindled, and the war began to wind down. In August 1676, the war officially ended, leaving both Native American communities and English settlements devastated. Lives were lost, property destroyed, and cultures forever altered. The war ended with the Treaty of Casco, which allowed the English to remain on all native lands. However, they were required to pay a light tribute of 1 peck of corn per English family settled on native land. A peck is equivalent to 2 dry gallons, or 16 dry pints, a relatively insignificant amount for the farmers of Massachusetts Bay. While back in England, another religious group was challenging the tenets of Anglicanism, the Quakers. One of their most controversial ideas was the concept of inner light, which states that there is a divine spark within each individual that allows for direct communication with God, without needing a state-appointed bishop or a king. They also rejected all formal titles, spanning from Your Highness to Mother. Every Quaker was to be referred to by their first name, regardless of status. King Charles would be referred to as Charles. Quaker kids would call their mother by their first name. This mere concept of rejecting hierarchical titles put them on the outskirts of British society. So, William Penn made it his mission to find a place for his church to go. It also helped that King Charles II was indebted to William Penn's father for £16,000, or £2.8 million today. Instead of receiving cash, William Penn asked for land in the New World to house his fellow Quakers. On March 4, 1681, Charles signed the order, creating the colony of Pennsylvania. When William Penn arrived at his colony on the ship Welcome in October 1682, he went to a tiny settlement and named it in Greek Phileo Adelphos, which would translate into English, the City of Brotherly Love. A city where all people, regardless of race, creed, religion, or gender, could prosper. A place where no one would be unfairly prosecuted. A place, in theory, where a white man and a black man could shake hands as equals. As Penn would refer to it, this was a holy experiment because he believed in a famous Quaker tenet that all people are equal under the eyes of God. However, the English Empire was in turmoil once again after King Charles II died in 1685. His successor, James II, was a staunch Roman Catholic who took the throne. He thought it was important to grant rights of religious freedom across the land. However, the Anglican majority were livid when James appointed Catholics to powerful positions, violating the Test Act, which made that very act illegal to do so. But the birth of an heir truly set the kingdom on edge. James's second wife, Mary of Modena, bore him a son, a Catholic heir who threatened to establish a line of monarchs devoted to the Catholic faith. Fears of a Catholic dynasty ran rampant, shaking the Protestant establishment's core. In the shadows, a group of nobles and political leaders known as the Immortal Seven whispered their concerns. They felt the kingdom was hurling towards absolutism, with the monarchy overshadowing the power of Parliament and the rule of law. They knew something had to be done to protect their beliefs. Their hopes turned to Prince William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to quell his father-in-law's desire for religious acceptance. In 1688, William's fleet sailed to the shores of England. His arrival was met with a surprising lack of resistance, as many of James's supporters defected to his side. James II's grasp on power weakened as his supporters dwindled. Fearing for his safety, he fled to France in the dead of night, leaving a kingdom in turmoil and an uncertain future. With the throne vacant, William and Mary, Protestantism's chosen protectors, accepted the leadership mantle. Parliament seized the moment to enact lasting change. In 1689, they passed the Bill of Rights, a cornerstone of constitutional principles that established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy, curbed the monarch's power, and protected individual rights. However, once the news spread to America, the Protestants were ready to revolt. In April 1689, news of the Glorious Revolution in England reached the American colonies. Protestant settlers in New York revolted against the Catholic governor, Jacob Leisler, seizing control of Fort James. They established a provisional government in the name of William and Mary. Around the same time in Massachusetts, the English in Boston overthrew the Catholic governor, Sir Edmund Andros, who had imposed unpopular policies. They arrested Andros and restored their previous political structure, declaring loyalty to William and Mary. The French Catholics, seeing this as an attack on their faith and the will of the papacy, decided to fight back. However, much to France's surprise, most of Europe was pinned against them. England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain were all aligned to stop the French in what was referred to as the Grand Alliance. On a bloody day in 1690, the Battle of Fleurus saw the French secure victory against the Grand Alliance forces in the Spanish Netherlands. This battle solidified France's hold on key territories in the region. Across the seas in Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne marked a clash between the forces of the deposed Catholic King James II and those of his Protestant successor, King William III. William emerged victorious, securing his hold on the English and Irish thrones. However, the war was not just a European battle. It spanned the entire world. In 1690, a series of clashes erupted, including the Battle of Port Royal. English forces attempted to capture the French stronghold in Acadia, present-day Nova Scotia, but their efforts were thwarted. French and Abenaki forces launched raids against English settlements in the province of Maine, sowing fear and uncertainty among the settlers. Battles like the Siege of Pemaquid showcased the complexities of alliances, as indigenous tribes aligned with European powers to further their interests. In the Battle of Quebec, saw an English expedition attempt to capture the critical French stronghold in Canada. Despite their efforts, the English forces were unsuccessful in their endeavor, creating a firm boundary between the two nations' colonies. On September 20th, 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick was signed, marking the end of the 9 Years' War. In this treaty, it was officially declared that William of Orange was the leader of England. It also stopped the French offensive. While the Nine Year was underway in Europe and the Americas, the English were in their first war in India. Because at the time, the English East India Company had a trade monopoly in the area. The company wanted to obtain ownership of Chittagong, establish a fortified enclave throughout the region, and attain independence of the surrounding Soba from the Mughal territory by bringing the local governors and the Hooghly River to their control. However, Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb refused these desired English terms. So, the East India Company Navy blockaded several Mughal ports on the western coast of India and engaged the Mughal army in battle. The blockade started to affect cities like Chittagong, Madras, and Bombay, which resulted in the intervention of Emperor Aurangzeb, who seized all the factories of the company and arrested members of the East India Company army. In 1690, the Mughal fleet from Hindhira, commanded by Sidi Yaqub, blockaded the East India Company fort in Bombay. After a year of resistance and famine in the fort, the company surrendered, and the company sent envoys to Aurangzeb's court to plead for a pardon and to renew the trade. The company's envoys had to prostrate themselves before the emperor paid a hefty imperial fine of 150,000 rupees, the equivalent of 4.4 million today. Emperor Aurangzeb then ordered Sidi Yaqub to lift the siege of Bombay, and the company subsequently re-established itself in Bombay and set up a new base in Calcutta. While back over in England, when Queen Anne took over for William in 1702, the structure of the government within the British Isles was quite unique. There were 4 kingdoms, 3 parliaments, and 1 monarch. Scotland had their own parliament and set of laws, while they were still under the power of the British monarch. Ireland also had their own parliament with statutes and still abiding the British monarch. England and Wales shared a parliament, as Wales was more assimilated into English culture. That, of course, still followed the British monarch. In 1707, though, Scotland was dealing with the economic turmoil of corruption, resource depletion, and an increasingly powerful elite. The wealthy knew that they could increase their power if they combined Parliament. Many Scottish officials were bribed, such as Earl of Glasgow, David Boyle, and 2nd Duke of Queensberry, James Douglas, who received around £20,000, £4 million today, to end the Scottish Parliament. The poor hated this, but they were ignored. So on May 1st, 1707, the Scottish and English Parliament combined to form the Parliament of Great Britain, based in the Palace of Westminster, which housed the Old English Parliament. As any semblance of Scottish independence was gone, anger spread throughout Scotland, but nothing was done about it. However, for England, this uniting of Parliament created the term Great Britain, was the beginning of the empire. Though the Treaty of Ryswick was designed to keep the peace between England and France, it was short-lived. In 1707, they were again fighting over the colonies in America due to a succession issue in Spain. The Spanish King Charles II was dying of ill health without any children. 2 rival claims emerged to seize the Spanish crown: Archduke Charles of Austria, a Habsburg scion, and Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince and possible successor to France's King Louis XIV. The English feared a united French and Spanish throne because it would increase Catholicism's power worldwide. So, the English staunchly declared war. Even though this war started about who should be king of Spain, it ended by restructuring European colonization. The first battle on American soil was in Fort Albany, where French commander Claude de Ramsay and his men wanted to knock out the English trading post. Fort Albany's wooden walls and palisades stood as barriers, separating the defenders from the impending storm. Inside the fort, English traders and soldiers braced for the confrontation that was about to unfold. But the fort was no match to heavy French cannon fire and was later surrendered to the French. However, the English weren't done, because English and French settlers wrestled over territorial boundaries in the rugged wilderness of Acadia. Upon leaving England, commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch came to Acadia to gain the territory for the crown. Upon the rocky shores of Port Royal, the battle for dominance unfolded. English warships loomed on the horizon, their cannons primed and ready. The colonial troops, resolute in purpose, embarked upon a siege of the French stronghold. Within the fortifications, Governor Daniel Dogger de Subercase led a valiant French garrison. Days turned to nights as the siege pressed on, the thud of cannonballs and the roar of muskets reverberating through the air. Amid the chaos, negotiations began. On a crisp October day, white flags of truce fluttered above the ramparts. Governor Subercase, recognizing the inevitable, surrendered. On October 5, 1710, the gates of Port Royal swung open, and the English entered victorious. The French colors lowered, replaced by the Union Jack. Acadia, once French, was now under English control. Annapolis Royal it was named, a tribute to the Queen whose reign witnessed this turning point in history. As the war was ending, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in the Netherlands, declaring King Philip V the rightful king of the Spanish throne. However, the other provision, the Asiento de Negros, gave the English immense economic power. For context, the Spanish were never really the people who went through the process of transferring enslaved people from Africa. Instead, they exported the labor of it in a monopoly called Asiento de Negros. Before the treaty, the French had the contract, but part of the peace deal, that contract went to the English, so they could be a leader in the lucrative and dehumanizing practice of the transatlantic slave trade. The treaty caused the French to cede the territories of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and territories in Rupert's Land in North America. The Spanish ceded the colonies of Gibraltar and Minorca in the Caribbean. While global politics were being discussed in the Netherlands, the Carolinas reshaped their society. Instead of being one united Carolina, they split up into a North and South Carolina. South Carolina was fertile, great for sugarcane production, and had access to more raw materials. North Carolina, on the other hand, was slightly less fertile and economically less valuable. So, South Carolina became a jewel for the British Empire, which led to the need for more and more production of raw goods. To produce these goods, they needed to increase their power over slaves. So, in 1712, South Carolina passed the notorious Slave Codes of 1712. Though it is quite hard to hear, this nasty document outlined the viewpoints of slave-owning colonists and what they felt they had the right to do. The code states, Negroes and other slaves brought unto the people of this province for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and such as renders them wholly unqualified to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province. This code created a quite harsh set of rules that included practices such as slaves were forbidden to leave the owner's property unless they were accompanied by a white person or had permission. If a slave leaves the owner's property without permission, every white person is required to chastise, whip, such slaves. Any slave attempting to run away and leave the colony receives the death penalty. Any slave who evades capture for 20 days or more is to be publicly whipped for the first offense, branded with the letter R on the right cheek for the second offense, and lose one ear if absent for 30 days for the third offense, and castrated for the fourth offense. This code became the forefront of slave treatment within the American colonies and the rest of the world. To the people of Carolinas, slaves were nothing more than tools for farmland to make a profit for their owners. At the time, though, there were approximately 40,000 slaves in North America. However, down south in the Caribbean islands of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, the need for slaves in British colonies grew exponentially because of the profitable yet labor-intensive crop of sugarcane. To cultivate a simple stalk of sugarcane, first slaves would have to clear the space of all other vegetation in 100+ degree heat, 38 degrees Celsius, to create a clear farming surface. Then, you had to put little sugarcane stalks into the soil repeatedly. Once planted, slaves would have to weed, hoe, and maintain the crops on a massive plantation that spanned hundreds of acres. Slaves would also have to build canals to ensure the sugarcane was adequately hydrated, while they barely had enough to drink. Then, after 12 to 18 months, slaves used machetes to cut off the stalks and farm an adult sugarcane. This process was so physically grueling, as they were often malnourished, overheated, and forced to work 18-hour-plus days, that slaves would die left and right. That's why the English would enslave and transport around 200,000 Africans from 1710 to 1720 to the Americans, so they could always have fresh labor. Sugar doesn't always taste that sweet. While back in England, James Oglethorpe wanted to create a colony home to the worthy poor, individuals who struggled financially in England so that they could have a fresh start overseas. English citizens convicted of owing debt had a choice: go to prison or go to the swamps of Georgia. In November 1732, 144 colonists, including Oglethorpe, boarded the Anne and Gravesend English and sailed to Savannah on February 12, 1733. Unlike their neighbors in the Carolinas, Georgia banned all slavery in the colony. Instead of having these massive plantations, Georgians would farm their own small farms, where they could make enough food for their families. Oglethorpe wanted the colonists to create a comfortable living, but not be incredibly wealthy. The other main fear of introducing slavery would be that the Spanish colony of Florida offered freedom to any African slave who went to their border and joined their army. If slavery was permitted, there would be very little to stop the slaves from feeding the Spanish army and expanding their American interests. However, that wouldn't stop the two nations from going to war, because before Georgia was even a colony in 1731, British merchant Robert Jenkins was notorious for raiding Spanish ships and stealing their resources. One day, a Spanish privateer captured Jenkins and, as punishment, severed his ear. Jenkins then proceeded to present the ear to Parliament, and the outraged English demanded retribution. For 8 years, the two nations tried to solve this conflict peacefully, but in January 1740, Oglethorpe and his men invaded and seized two Spanish forts, Fort Picolata and Fort San Francisco de Pupo. The Georgian general wanted to go further in Florida and capture Fort St. Augustine, but quickly realized he didn't have enough forces and retreated back to Georgia. All Oglethorpe could do was fortify and prepare for the incoming invasion. That assault came in the summer of 1742. After landing on the southern tip of St. Simon's Island, the Spanish assembled to attack the English fort of Frederica. English Rangers encountered a scouting party, and Oglethorpe led the charge against the Spanish soldiers, who hastily fled the scene. While Oglethorpe returned to Frederica, his men fortified the road to the fort to prevent further incursions. A second skirmish ensued, an event later known as the Battle of Bloody Marsh, when the Spanish advanced another regiment. English forces sent the Spanish fleeing to the coastline, and from there, retreating to St. Augustine. The War of Jenkins' Ear wasn't just an American affair, it also spanned over to the Carnatic region of southern India. The English, with their Indian allies led by Anwaruddin, supported the claim to the Carnatic throne. On the other side, under the leadership of the ambitious Governor-General Dupleix, the French had forged an alliance with Chandos Sahib, a contender for the throne of the Carnatic. The tensions escalated in 1744 when a spark ignited the powder keg of colonial rivalry. The Battle of Adjar was a pivotal moment where the French defeated the English forces with their superior military tactics. It was a resounding victory for the French, and their influence in the Carnatic seemed unstoppable. Buoyed by their success, the French laid siege to the English-controlled city of Madras in 1746. The English, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, had no choice but to surrender the city to the triumphant French. But all of this was about to change because of the primary battle in the disputed territory of Austria. The Prussians, Dutch, Spanish, French, and independence movements claimed this territory. The English, not wanting to be left out of it, decided to ally with the Dutch and try to put them in power. In the summer of 1747, the Battle of Lawfeld occurred, where the British, Dutch, and Austrian forces, led by Duke Cumberland, tried to infiltrate the French defense. However, they could not go through the French security, led by Maurice de Saxe, allowing the battle to end in stalemate. But nevertheless, diplomacy is sometimes where the real battles are fought. By the time all parties were done fighting in 1748, a favorable peace deal for the British emerged with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. They agreed to restore almost all territorial shifts to their pre-war status quo. This means Madras was back in English hands, even though they lost it in battle. The peace treaty also officially created an English and French border between Georgia and Florida, and the St. Johns River in the Americas. Also, Austria succeeded and became its own country under the leadership of Maria Theresa. After the war, in Georgia, the question of slavery was returned to the table. Oglethorpe remained adamant that slavery not be allowed. But with the unenforceable nature of the illegal importation of slaves from South Carolina, it quickly became a lost cause. The worthy poor didn't want to be poor, they wanted to be rich like their neighbors. So, on January 1st, 1751, slavery was permitted with a code almost identical to South Carolina's and passed. This change, though, ultimately hurt the worthy poor Oglethorpe designed Georgia to help, because the South Carolinian migrants enjoyed a significant wealth advantage over the original settlers of Georgia. They quickly established socio-economic structures and relationships nearly identical to those they had known in their colony. Within 20 years, some 60 planters who owned roughly half the colony's rapidly increasing enslaved population dominated the apex of low-country Georgia's rice economy. However, not all of America was a slave colony. In the forests of North America lay the Ohio Valley, a swath of 300,000 acres home to forests, fur pelts, and the opportunity to expand. Hence, the Ohio Company of Virginia was founded by Augustine Washington, George Washington's father, to find a way to make a profit from the natural landscape. A young George Washington was tasked with surveying and mapping the company's land holdings in the region. What he found, though, was concerning from a British perspective. The land was already home to the Shawnee and Delaware tribes, both of which were unhappy about the British expansion into the colony. The French were also present in the region with their lucrative fur trading business. The land was littered with French forts, such as the Fort Duquesne, constructed at the intersection of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers in modern-day Pittsburgh. By April 1754, when tensions between the English and French were boiling, 22-year-old George Washington was sent out with a small detachment of troops determined to secure the valley. Deep in the heart of the wilderness, Washington's party stumbled upon a secluded glen known as Jumonville Glen. In this hidden grove, Washington's men stumbled upon a small French force, led by a man named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, a French enlisted man. Tensions were high, and the forest was thick with suspense. No one knew what lay ahead. On the fateful morning of May 28, 1754, in a way clouded by the mysteries of war, Joseph was killed. The English would say his death occurred amid battle, but the French would say it was a calculated assassination attempt. The French, seeking revenge for the death of Jumonville, were incensed. They surrounded Washington and his men, who had retreated to a makeshift fort called Fort Necessity. Trapped and outnumbered, Washington was forced to surrender on July 3, 1754. Among the terms of surrender was Washington's acknowledgement that he had assassinated Jumonville. The ball of war was rolling. In Saxony, Europe, Prussian King Frederick II invaded Saxony, which put the world on notice as this bloody worldwide conflict began. The 7 Years' War was our planet's first world war. It expanded over 3 continents: the Americas, Europe, and India. The European powers were trying to gain control for their civilization to have worldwide influence, while the local nations were fighting for survival. The tides were shifting and the world was now completely global. The war did not start off great for the British when the governor of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, captured Fort William in Calcutta, the home of the British East India Company. When the Bengalese soldiers entered the fort, they imprisoned 146 Englishmen into a tiny dungeon, where they were supposed to be transferred in the morning. However, these conditions were so appalling and dismal that, according to John Howell, one of the prisoners, 123 of the 146 people died in that dungeon. The smell of death reeked throughout the fort as they opened the door to the black hole of Calcutta. When the news got around, the English were determined to restore the fort and gain revenge on the victims of the black hole. However, their traction was quickly fleeting, and they needed to do anything to keep their foot on the wheel in India. That's when British officer Robert Clive rounded up his British soldiers to take down Siraj in the village of Plassey in Bengal. As the two armies faced each other on that fateful day in June, Siraj-ud-Daulah held the advantage. His forces outnumbered Clive's, and the heat of the Indian sun bore down upon the battlefield. But appearances can be deceiving. Clive had a secret weapon in his arsenal: betrayal. He had forged alliances with local officials discontented with Siraj-ud-Daulah's rule. Among them was Mir Jafar, a man with ambitions of his own. The battle began, and it quickly became apparent that Siraj-ud-Daulah's forces were poorly coordinated. Meanwhile, Mir Jafar and his supporters were ready to make their move. As the battle raged, Mir Jafar's forces defected, turning the tide in favor of the British. The British forces secured victory that day. Siraj-ud-Daulah was captured and promptly executed. Mir Jafar was installed as the new governor, a puppet ruler under British influence. While a few short months later, in September, a naval and land battle would occur at Negapatam within the Maratha territory. As the French made their way to Negapatam under the leadership of Kamti Dalali, the allied English and Maratha forces were ready for action. The battle commenced with naval clashes off the coast of Negapatam, as the British and French fleets locked horns in a fierce contest of cannon fire and naval maneuvering. On land, the British and Marathas advanced against the well-fortified French positions.